I'm Sister Tracey Horan. I'm a Sister of Providence of St. Mary of the Woods, and I've been ministering here in Nogales at the Kino Border Initiative since 2019, so about 6 years. And I've been reflecting a lot about this Jubilee Year of Hope. This can be a hard place to live into that hope. We don't always feel just a joyful hopefulness with different challenges that are happening and the families that we're accompanying. But last year I had an experience that for me helped me understand how I could live into hope in these circumstances with people on the move who are sometimes facing family separation or have just been deported or who are fleeing some kind of danger or threats to their lives. Part of what I do as Associate Director of Education and Advocacy is to help people lift up complaints about abuses that happen to them when they interact with U.S. officials, whether that be Border Patrol, Customs and Border Protection, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And last year I was talking with a woman. I saw her, she kind of stood out to me at our Migrant Outreach Center because when she came in, she had a neck brace on. And later I learned that she had been in an accident. And she shared with me that she and her family, they had tried to cross into the US, her and her husband, her brother-in-law, her little kids, and they had been detained in the desert late at night, in the dark. And the Border Patrol agent who detained her, he was driving dangerously fast. If you know the Arizona desert, it can be pretty flat and open, so he was really going fast through those desert roads late at night. And the vehicle they were in struck a cow. And so nobody was buckled in, and a lot of them suffered bruises when they hit the metal of the seats. And the Border Patrol agent didn't seem too concerned about their injuries, but immediately he started pleading with them not to say that he had been driving recklessly fast and not to say that they had been injured. And this woman, I'll call her Marisol, not to use her real name, she decided not to stay quiet. When they arrived at the Border Patrol station, it seemed that all of the officers were more concerned about this Border Patrol agent and that he wouldn't get in trouble than they were about the well-being of the family. They didn't get any medical care or attention, and they were simply deported back to Mexico. And so Marisol, in our conversation, she said that she wanted to share what had happened to them so that the same thing wouldn't continue happening to other families that were in her situation. So I accompanied the family. They wanted to file a complaint, and we went to the port of entry where they could talk with an officer and be interviewed about what had happened to them. We were there for a while, and the kids I had some toys there for them to play with. They were, getting kind of antsy after a couple of hours of these different interviews. And right before the process was over, Marisol looked at me and she said, "Y ahora qué pasa? What happens now?" And what I told her was, I can't make any promises, but I can tell you that, the government now will have to investigate what happened to you. They will have to look into the details of this incident, but I can't promise that anything will necessarily happen as a result. And it was really heavy to have to respond in that way. And I'll never forget what it was like when she asked that question. I just kind of felt my stomach drop. But and then we walked back across the border, and her family continued on their journey. And it really had an impact on me because I would love to be able to promise her this hopeful response of be able to say, yes, there will be consequences and no one will have to suffer what you've suffered. But I knew that I couldn't promise her that. So fast forward in a couple of months, I was looking through my emails and just sorting through, and I found an email. Responses to these complaints, sometimes they're just like a template. There's not a whole lot of information, but I was surprised to find an email that did have a little more detail about one of the complaints I had filed, and actually said that there had been an investigation as a result of that complaint, and they had made some recommendations about how people would be treated when they were hospitalized in Border Patrol custody. And then I kept looking, and I found a second email. And then I found a third email, and I started putting the pieces together, and I realized that these complaints that I had filed in 2020, in 2021, 2022 about people who were denied medical care, people who were deported to Nogales just with a hospital gown and slippers, people who had been denied a surgery because Border Patrol was in too much of a hurry to allow them the medical care that they needed. that all of those pieces were being put together, and as a result, there were changes that were made. There were new protocols put in place about how discharge would work for people who were hospitalized in Border Patrol custody, that they would actually have to document the treatment and they would have to document the steps that they took to respond to their injuries. And for me, I immediately thought of Marisol, and I immediately thought of the people who had made the decision to lift up their voices and to speak out about what happened to them, knowing that they couldn't control the outcome, but that they believed that their voice mattered, and that they had some sense that because they decided to speak, maybe someone in the future wouldn't be denied surgery. Maybe someone in the future would have their belongings returned to them. Maybe someone in the future would actually know, they would have an x-ray, or they would know what medical processes had happened when they were hospitalized. And for me, that's the kind of hope that we see here in Nogales. When they arrive, we offer them, if they need a change of clothes, we have breakfast every day, and we have a meal at 1 p.m. They can have shelter. We also have psychosocial accompaniment. So we have social workers and we have a psychologist on staff to really try to help people. A lot of times people are dealing with a lot of emotions. They've been through some trauma and trying to figure out what resources they have and decide on their next steps. And we also have lawyers, we have legal assistants, we have activities for the kids, and we do that through a few different organizations. So it's really a holistic way of meeting people where they are and trying to ask them, what is it they need, and accompany them as they make their decisions about what they want to do next. After World War II happened, there was a group of countries that came together and said, never again will we return people to danger. We kind of looked at all of the people who had been persecuted, and people were asking, how did this happen? And so there were, at an international level, countries that made agreements to say, we're going to have protections for certain groups of people. And that's kind of where the asylum process was born, protections for people who are seeking refuge in a different country. So, that's back in the 50s and 60s where that started. But in the US, until 2018, people could come to a port of entry, a border crossing here, and they could say, I'm fleeing danger, I can't stay here in Mexico, or I'm not safe in my country of origin. And they would begin a process. They would do a background check, and they would ask, who's going to receive you in the US, do some questions, DNA swab and all of that. And within a few hours, people would continue their process, go to their court hearings in the US until, a US judge or an asylum officer would decide if they did qualify for asylum. What we've seen over the last 5 or 6 years is little by little different policies that have made that process more and more difficult. So now if you arrive here in Nogales, we're about 3 blocks away from the downtown port of entry. And I was just talking to a couple today that said in February they had walked up to one of the US officials and they had papers in hand explaining they're fleeing political persecution. The husband of this couple had run for office, and because of that political affiliation, he started being targeted directly and had death threats against him. So even though they brought that proof with them and showed it to a US officer, they were told, sorry, there's nothing that we can do for you. Whereas in the past, they would be able to begin a process. They would do the vetting and all of that, go to their court hearings, and then be able to determine whether they qualified for asylum or not. So at this point, there is no way for people to actually seek a legal pathway to protection in the US when they arrive here at the US-Mexico border. So for me, the work that we do here in accompanying people who are just trying to seek a better life, we're recognizing the dignity of each of those people. We want them to be connected with their families, to be able to find work, to be able to have a hot meal, and to find safety. I think those are things that all of us want. And for me, my faith calls me to accompany these people and to keep reminding those around me of the dignity that they have as children of God.